Daniel Mercer never believed in late-night superstitions, but he couldn't shake the habit of turning on his old radio before bed. His sister Claire thought it was nothing more than static, just wasted noise, but Daniel swore he heard voices hidden inside the hiss. The night Claire leaned in close to prove him wrong, the radio whispered both their names, and something else, something that promised it was already in the room with them. I always had a strange habit of listening to the radio at night, long after most stations had gone silent. The soft hiss of static calmed me, filling the empty spaces in my room, when the world outside was too quiet to bear. It felt like company, even though I knew it was only noise. I would lie in bed, turning the dial ever so slightly, searching for faint signals hidden in the dark. Most nights I found nothing, just broken snippets of voices that faded before I could understand them, or distorted music that never played long enough to recognize. But one night, something changed. It began as a whisper beneath the static, so faint I almost missed it, a vibration in the air, softer than breath. At first I thought it was part of a broadcast, maybe some weak station bleeding through, but the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't like anything I had heard before. It was deliberate, careful, a low murmur buried deep inside the noise. I leaned closer to the radio, holding my breath, straining to catch the sound. That's when I heard it clear enough that I couldn't deny it. A voice, a human voice, soft and rasping, whispering my name. The air in my room changed instantly. The temperature dropped, my skin prickled, and I felt my stomach sink. For a long moment I just stared at the radio, unable to breathe, trying to convince myself I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't my name. Maybe I was imagining things. I adjusted the dial back and forth, trying to find the source, but the more I turned it, the more the voice slipped away. And then, just as I was about to give up, it returned. Louder this time. My name, spoken slowly, as if savoring each syllable. I pulled back from the radio, heart pounding, my hands trembling. The room felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it had to be some strange coincidence. Maybe someone broadcasting on a hidden frequency, maybe a prank. But no one knew I would be listening at that hour. No one knew how often I turned that dial. The longer I sat there, the more the static seemed alive. It wasn't just sound anymore, it had weight, a presence pressing against me. My skin crawled with the sensation that I was no longer alone. Every shadow in the corners of my room seemed deeper, darker, stretching toward me in unnatural ways. I wanted to turn the radio off, to throw it across the room, but something held me there, as if invisible hands had settled on my shoulders, keeping me frozen in place. The voice whispered again, only this time it wasn't just my name, it said something else. Words too muffled to understand, but the tone was clear, hungry, insistent. I felt it in my bones. My breathing grew shallow, my chest tight, as if the very air was being pulled from the room. The glow of the radio dial dimmed and flickered, casting long, quivering shadows across the walls. My eyes burned as I stared at the speaker, waiting, afraid, but unable to stop. The sound grew louder, filling my ears until it was all I could hear. The static roared, and beneath it, the voice stretched thin and broken, repeating my name over and over like a chant. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The sound was inside me now, vibrating through my skull, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, heavy and suffocating. I sat there in the stillness, my body shaking, my mind spinning, praying it was finally over. But then, as the last trace of static faded, the voice cut through one final time, clearer than ever, sharp enough to slice through the air. It said, "I've found you." The words rang in my ears, cold and final, and in that instant I knew whatever was on the other end of that signal wasn't just a voice, wasn't just a trick of my tired mind. It was real, and now it knew exactly where I was. The next day passed in a blur, as though the world around me had dulled. My body moved, but my mind was elsewhere, trapped in the memory of that whisper. I tried to dismiss it as exhaustion or imagination, but the words clung to me like a stain I couldn't scrub away. "I've found you." Every time I repeated them in my head, my skin prickled, and my heart sank deeper into my chest. When night came, I told myself I wouldn't touch the radio again. I shoved it to the far end of my desk, even draped a towel over it, as though hiding it could erase what had happened. I kept the lights on and tried to sleep, but sleep never came. My body ached with tension, every creak of the house, every whisper of wind against the window making me flinch. The silence was unbearable. Without the soft hiss of static, the night felt wrong, hollow, too exposed. Eventually, against every instinct, I found myself pulling the towel away and setting the dial again. I told myself it was just to prove there was nothing there, that my mind had invented it. But deep down, I think I already knew what I would hear. The static came instantly, filling the room like rushing water. I almost felt relief, just noise, nothing more. My body eased a little, my heartbeat slowing. Then I heard it, not words this time. Breathing, slow, heavy, deliberate. It came in steady waves, as though someone stood just beyond the speaker. Their lips pressed against the microphone, their lungs dragging air in and out with a dreadful rhythm. It was too real, too human to dismiss as interference. My hand shot out for the power switch, but it froze just above the knob. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My fingers trembled in midair, useless. It was as if the sound itself had rooted me in place, pinning me down. I stared at the radio in horror, my pulse hammering in my ears, while the breathing went on, closer, louder, and then it changed. The static warped, stretching into something new. Footsteps. The sound was faint at first, distant, echoing through the static like someone walking down a long empty hallway. But each step grew heavier, sharper, dragging against the silence until I swore they were no longer far away. They were moving closer, slow and purposeful, as though whoever was walking already knew where they were headed. The air grew thick, pressing down on me. My body screamed to run, to smash the radio and end the nightmare, but I sat there, locked in place, waiting. The footsteps stopped, replaced by silence so complete I thought my ears had failed. I leaned forward slightly, straining to hear, my chest tight with dread. That's when I heard a faint tap against the glass of my window. My head snapped toward it, heart clawing at my ribs. Tap, a pause, another tap. The sound was sharp, deliberate, like knuckles rapping against glass. I forced myself to look, my stomach sinking as my eyes met the window. Nothing was there, only the pale reflection of my own terrified face staring back. But the glass was fogged over, smeared in a way I couldn't explain, as though something had pressed close enough to leave its breath behind. I tore my gaze back to the radio, praying the sound had stopped, but instead the static swelled again, louder than before, shaking the desk, filling the room with its suffocating roar, and buried inside it, faint but undeniable, I heard my name once more, drawn out, low, and broken. The voice sounded different now, closer, no longer drifting through the airwaves, no longer caught in static. It was as though it was standing just outside the thin walls of my room, whispering through the glass. My heart slammed against my chest as I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think until now. Whatever I was hearing wasn't trapped in the radio, it was trying to get in. Sleep abandoned me completely. Even when I shut the radio off, the noise still lingered in my ears, faint and endless, like a phantom signal burned into my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shapes moving behind the veil of static, faces twisted and indistinct, pressing against the screen like they were trapped on the other side. I would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, only to realize I hadn't truly slept at all. The exhaustion began to hollow me out. My reflection looked worse each day, pale and gaunt, the skin under my eyes bruised and dark. My body felt drained, as though something invisible was feeding on me while I lay in bed. I told myself I'd stop turning the dial, that I'd resist the urge. But every night when silence fell, the compulsion returned. It was no longer curiosity, it was need. I gave in again, almost against my will. The static greeted me instantly, rushing into the room with that same suffocating presence. But it wasn't the harmless hiss I had once known. It felt alive now, shifting and pulsing with a strange rhythm. I pressed closer to the speaker, my breath shallow, waiting for what I already knew was coming. The voice returned. Only this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was clearer, louder, weaving through the static like something crawling up from the depths. It repeated my name again and again, but there were other words threaded between. Words I couldn't always understand, words spoken in a language that scraped against my ears like knives. But one phrase was unmistakable. I heard my street name, then my house number. The blood in my veins turned to ice. I stumbled back from the desk, shaking my head as though denial could erase what I'd heard. My breathing grew ragged, panic clawing at my throat. How could it know that? How could it say my address, spoken as calmly as a friend telling me the time of day? I tried to unplug the radio. I yanked the cord free from the wall, desperate to kill the sound, but it didn't matter. The static roared on, stronger than ever, vibrating through the air, rattling the lamp on my nightstand. I grabbed the radio itself, hurling it to the floor, smashing it against the hardwood until the casing cracked and wires spilled out like veins. My chest heaved, relief flooding me as I stood over the wreckage. But when I turned back, it was there, sitting perfectly whole on the desk again, untouched, humming softly with its pale glow. My mouth went dry, my body trembling so violently I thought my knees would give way. I couldn't escape it. No matter what I did, it would always come back. The following nights blurred together. My world shrank until it was only me, the static, and the shadows that gathered in the corners of my room. Sometimes I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of black, a shift in the dark, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. I found scratches on my arms in the mornings, long thin lines that burned like fresh wounds, though I couldn't remember how I'd gotten them. The worst was the sound of laughter. It began faint, hidden under the layers of static, so soft I thought I was imagining it. But with each night, it grew clearer. A dry, broken laugh that rose and fell like it belonged to something ancient, something amused by my suffering. It echoed inside the signal, repeating endlessly until it filled the whole room, rattling my bones. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it made no difference. The sound wasn't coming from the outside anymore. It was burrowing deeper, threading its way inside my skull, settling into my thoughts. The static had seeped into me, and as I sat there in the dark, staring at the glowing dial, I realized something that froze me to the core. The laughter wasn't directed at the static, it was directed at me. I no longer recognized the space I lived in. My room felt like a shell, hollowed out and reshaped by the sound that never left. The static wasn't background noise anymore. It was the air itself, the walls, the floor beneath my feet. Even when I tried to leave the house, even when I walked down the street in daylight, the faint hiss followed me, whispering at the edges of my hearing like a phantom leash pulling me back. I began to hear more than voices. Beneath the waves of static, there were cries. Faint at first, then sharper, layered one on top of another, as though hundreds of people were trapped inside the frequency, their screams stretching across the hiss like cracks in glass. Sometimes it sounded like children, other times like grown men and women, their voices overlapping in a chorus of endless suffering. They would fade and return, twisting into sobs and gasps, and always accompanied by that cold laughter in between. The longer I listened, the more my room changed. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the static, stretching and contracting as if the entire house was breathing with it. My ceiling warped, sagging downward in places like heavy flesh pressing against a thin membrane. Shadows crawled across the corners, elongating into grotesque shapes that sometimes leaned too far toward me before dissolving into the dark. When I dared to look at myself in the mirror, I saw the changes there too. My skin had grown sallow, my lips cracked, my eyes hollowed and ringed with deep shadows. There were scratches across my arms and neck now, not just lines, but jagged marks, raw and angry, as though something with claws had tried to drag me somewhere while I slept. I stopped telling myself it was in my head. I knew better now. The radio wasn't broken or haunted in the way stories describe. It was a doorway. I could feel it with every surge of static, every pulse of sound that vibrated through my bones. Something was pressing against the threshold, something vast and hungry, clawing at the thin barrier between its world and mine. One night, the static shifted in a way that made my chest seize. It wasn't random noise anymore. It was a pattern. It rose and fell in slow, steady waves, sensing with my own breathing until I realized it wasn't following me, I was following it. The radio was breathing. The sound expanded and contracted like lungs inhaling and exhaling, as though the machine itself was alive. The longer I listened, the more my own breath aligned with it, until I couldn't tell where mine ended and its began. My body shook, my hands clammy as sweat trickled down my back. I wanted to look away, to run, to burn the thing to ash, but the static was pulling me forward, pressing my face closer to the speaker. The air around me thickened, buzzing with invisible pressure that made my teeth ache. The shadows on the walls quivered like wet paint, faces forming and collapsing within them, mouths opening wide in silent screams. Then, beneath the hiss, the voice returned. Not faint this time, not whispering. It boomed low and guttural, cutting through the static like a blade. It no longer called my name. It gave me a command. Open the door. The words slammed into me, vibrating through my skull, echoing inside my chest. I staggered back, shaking my head violently, my throat too tight to scream. My eyes darted to the door of my room, half expecting it to burst open. The knob rattled once, faintly, before stilling again. My stomach twisted with the horrible realization that it didn't mean the wooden door in front of me. It meant something else. The radio was the door, and the thing on the other side was getting closer. I don't remember when I finally gave in. Sleep had stopped visiting me, sanity had begun to fray, and the radio had become more than an obsession. It was a command. I woke one night to find it already on the dial, glowing pale in the dark like a single watching eye. The static was louder than it had ever been, a roaring storm that filled every corner of the room until it felt like the walls themselves were shaking. My chest seized with panic, but when I tried to move, I couldn't. My body refused me, heavy as stone, locked in place on the bed while the sound poured over me in suffocating waves. Shapes began to stir in the glow of the static. At first they were flickers, like shadows passing too close to the bulb of a lamp, but then they grew clearer, sharper, their outlines jerking and twitching as though stitched together from broken pieces of light. They had limbs, faces half-formed, bodies bent at impossible angles. Dozens of them, crowding the edges of the room, pressing against the walls. They looked like people, but not. Their skin flickered like poor reception, their mouths stretched to wide, opening and closing without sound. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My throat burned, my eyes watered, my heart hammered in my chest so hard I thought it would split. The radio pulsed with each breath, its glow swelling, brighter and brighter, until the room was bathed in sickly light. The figures moved closer, their forms bleeding into the walls, their faces rippling in and out of focus. And then the voice came. It wasn't outside anymore. It wasn't hidden in the static. It was inside me, a cold, heavy presence that pressed against the back of my eyes and filled the hollow spaces of my skull. It spoke without sound, but I heard it as clearly as if it had leaned close to my ear. You've been listening too long. The weight of the words crushed me. I felt them settle into my bones, into the marrow itself, as if I had become nothing more than a vessel for the noise. The static cut off abruptly, and the silence that followed was unbearable. It was thick, suffocating, louder than any sound I had ever known. My body jerked, freed from its paralysis, and slowly, against my will, I turned my head toward the radio. The dial wasn't glowing anymore. The speaker wasn't hissing. Instead, I saw something that made my stomach twist and my blood run cold. My reflection, staring back at me from the speaker's black surface, distorted and warped like a face in murky water. It grinned, though I did not. Its lips stretched upward in a smile too wide, its teeth jagged, its eyes nothing but hollow pits. I stumbled back, nearly falling, but the reflection leaned forward as though pressing against the other side of glass. Its mouth moved, and though the room was silent, I heard the words echo inside my skull. "Let me out." I shook my head violently, clutching my ears, but the words didn't stop. They grew louder, layered, repeating endlessly, until they blended with the phantom screams I had heard in the static. My own voice, begging, pleading, clawing at the barrier between us. I could hear myself inside, trapped, calling from the other side of the signal. The figures in the corners began to dissolve, sinking into the walls like ink in water. The light dimmed, shadows lengthened, and the reflection in the radio leaned closer still, its grin splitting wider, its face warping with hunger. My chest tightened as a sick understanding bloomed inside me. The static hadn't been voices of strangers, it had been people like me, people who had listened too long. The radio hasn't gone silent since day or night. The faint hiss hums low, vibrating through the floor, seeping into my dreams, and whenever I lean too close to the speaker, I hear it. My own voice, muffled, desperate, clawing for escape. I don't know how much longer I can resist. Sooner or later, the door will open, and when it does, I'm not sure which version of me will step out.